The Toothless Historian, all bite and no bark. I'm Stephen Zacharias, the Toothless Historian, and on today's episode, we choose to remember December 31st, 1862. It was more than just your average New Year's Eve. And for one man in the Pacific Northwest, it was the realization of a dream that for his sons, the world might just be a little bit different than the one that he grew up in. That man was a pioneer of Washington Territory, a founder of Thurston County and Tumwater, Washington. A man you may get confused with another man by a similar name, that of George W. Bush. Washington pioneer George Washington Bush. Attendees would gather throughout the evening of watch night, often with an address to whoever was presiding over it. This ceremony being a mixture of indigenous religions, both of the African continent and the North American continent, as well as traditions found in Christianity and Islam. A variety of other religious cultures would come together during this celebration. Whoever was leading it would be called upon by the congregation, "Watchman, watchman, what is the hour?" For one particular free black man, or mulatto as he is noted, George Washington Bush was in December 31st, 1862, residing in Thurston County, Washington Territory, along the Little Deschutes River at Bush Prairie, a place that he had established upon arrival in the territory in 1845. There's a lot we don't know or can't confirm about George Washington Bush. We know that he was probably born during George Washington's second term as President of the United States, most likely born somewhere in Pennsylvania, most likely the city of Philadelphia. His father and mother were servants for a man who appears to have been a merchant operator of the British East India Merchant Company. Upon his father and mother's owner or employer, however you want to look at it, it is suggested that Matthew Bush, George's father, was either purchased or acquired by Mr. Stevenson in India, brought him back to Philadelphia, and in that household where Matthew Bush worked was also or may have been enslaved, was also an Irish woman servant, maid, in that same household. The two would be married. Mr. Stevenson appears to have been a Quaker, and we do not know if Matthew and his wife's ceremony was sanctioned or not. Mr. Stevenson seems to have approved of their marriage, and Matthew Bush and his wife would see out Mr. Stevenson throughout his life. Upon he and his wife's passing, it appears that if Matthew wasn't already emancipated or free, that he was granted his freedom, and the Bushes were bequeathed or inherited the Stevenson family wealth, as Mr. and Mrs. Stevenson had no children. Their son, George Washington Bush, would go on to become a successful cattle rancher, it would appear, in both Illinois and Missouri. In Missouri, when George W. Bush first arrived there, It was originally French-held territory, and he would later fight under Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, made popular in the Johnny Horton song. And he would then continue to live his life in Missouri later in life, marrying a German American woman, Miss Isabella, in Clay County, Missouri. Now, some records have attributed that to Clay County, Tennessee. However, we were able to verify by their marriage license here that Isabella and George W. Bush actually resided in Clay County, Missouri. 1843, following the successful journey by the Whitmans to near what is now Walla Walla, Washington, and perhaps sensing the pressure of society there in Missouri, George W. Bush thought that if they stayed in Missouri, it was very likely that Missouri was going to become a state that would support the institution of slavery, which for his mixed race sons and perhaps even for himself would not be ideal for George Washington Bush. So what he decided to do was to partner with a close friend and neighbor of his, Colonel Michael T. Simmons, along with several others, and they began to plan their journey to head west to Oregon Territory, where they might be able to establish a better life for George W. Bush, his wife Isabella, and their son. During their overland journey to the Oregon Territory, it's reported by several members of the party that George Bush informed others that if he could not be given free man's rights in the Oregon Territory, that he would then seek his freedom in either California or New Mexico, under the protection of the Mexican government, where he felt he would be given the rights of a free man. He and others, they arrived in the winter of 1844 in the Dalles, Oregon, where you made a decision. Either head over the mountain pass through the Barlow Trail or to float on down the Columbia River. It was during this stay over winter in the Dalles that William T. Simmons and George W. Bush became aware of the Oregon Lash Law, a law enacted that while Oregon was not to be a slave-holding state or territory, they would enact laws that would forbid persons of color from owning land or settling in the territory, and that if you did decide to stay for whatever reason, you could be lashed every 6 months up to 39 times until you quit the territory. This lash law and perhaps some other influences convinced Colonel Simmons and George W. Bush and others to cross over into the Washington side of the Columbia River and head north. From Fort Vancouver, they headed up into the drainage of the southern Puget Sound area, establishing the very first known American settlement. About 4, 5, 6 families or so would settle with the Bushes along the Little Deschutes River in an area that would become known as Bush Prairie. Despite their efforts to establish a settlement north of the Columbia River in a region of the country that was loosely managed or overseen by British rule, thanks to the Hudson Bay Company's establishment at Fort Vancouver and their use of the area, and that the majority of American citizens had settled in the Willamette Valley on the south side of the Columbia River, Unfortunately, as the fight over that territory started to become settled, and it appeared that the Washington Territory would now fall under the purview of the United States government in 1850, George W. Bush and his sons, his wife included as she was married to him, would technically in 1850 lose all rights to their homestead that they had created there on Bush Prairie, because George Washington Bush, being of mixed race, despite being a free black man, he was still a person of color, and therefore, by the rules of the Oregon Territory at the time, was not entitled to own land or have rights to the land that he had established. As early as 1853, many of his neighbors, the people that had come and he had helped them establish their homes, had provided food for, began to write and campaign to the Washington Territorial Legislature, which did in fact put together a document and an argument to the United States Congress in 1854, asking that George W. Bush and his family be given the right to their homestead and the land that they were on. And in 1855, the United States Congress passed an act that would enable the land, the 640 acres that they had established at Bush Prairie, to go back to the family of George W. Bush and his heirs. An act for the relief of George Bush of Thurston County, Washington Territory, approved by Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives of the United States of America, February 10th, 1855. In Tumwater, George Bush would continue his success as a cattle rancher. And additionally, he would add to his repertoire, becoming known for his wheat production, fruit, and vegetable production. This was something that he would have maintained and improve upon and pass on to his children even after his death. George Washington Bush didn't just come on the Oregon Trail in 1844 with Colonel Simmons and others. He helped finance, inheriting a large sum from his parents when they passed, but also he would sell off his properties in Missouri to help finance the overland exhibition from Missouri to Oregon. Along the way, being able to purchase flour and sugar at premium prices so they would be assured to achieve their destination with enough supplies for the entire party. It's said, rumored perhaps more than anything, that he had built a false bottom in his wagon where he brought his gold and silver with him to Oregon. Upon the establishment of the homesteads along the Little Deschutes River there near Bush Prairie and Tumwater, it's said that George W. Bush also helped finance the first sawmill and grist mill that his white counterparts had established. Ezra Meeker, the great Oregon Trail pioneer, guide, and proponent to keep it memorialized and have all the markers that we see today built along its trail. He, in a biographical sketch that he did on the great pioneer George Bush, wrote that the man, George W. Bush, divided out nearly his whole crop to new settlers who came with or without money. He wrote that Meeker wrote that Bush often said, "Pay me next year or whenever you can." He would say to those in need of money, and those who were in no need of money, he would remind them to never take too much. Just enough for you will do. This generous spirit of George Washington is also played out in a story about the night that a young traveler came through Bush Prairie on his way to the State House in Olympia and stayed at the Bushes for a meal. When he offered to pay, George Bush refused him that payment, and it's rumored that that man, the first territorial governor, the first governor of Washington, being Isaac Stevens, put a gold coin underneath his plate before he left. George Washington Bush would welcome all to his family's home there in Bush Prairie. He would establish relationships with both the Nisqually and the Puyallup tribes. Even his one son, reported to be the first non-native to be born in all of Washington Territory, Louis Nisqually Bush, would carry on the name of the tribe that he seems to be the most connected to. Even reports that he learned to read and write in their tongue as to better communicate with them. Sharing his success of fruit, his bounty of vegetables and meat and wheat as well with the native tribes. December 31st, 1862 would be, sadly, George W. Bush's first and his last Freedom's Eve. Now, we do not have specific reports of what the Bush family was doing that night, but from other parts of history and things that have been written about the Bush family, we can only imagine that they too were anxious to see the freedom that was about to come to those found themselves in the enslaved states of the American South. We do know, unfortunately, that it would be several more years, and it wouldn't be until 1865 that places like the Bush's home state of Missouri would finally have the freedom that was promised in the Emancipation Proclamation. The Bush family would go on to leave a great legacy. George W. Bush would pass away in April of 1863, having seen some of the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation freeing Black Americans throughout the southern states, and the effect that it had. I think perhaps he would have been more interested in, while the Act of Congress in 1855 provided him and his family security and their right to own their location there at Bush Prairie, but it was still not something that anybody could do. That act was only an exemption for George Bush and his family. It did not release the Lash laws or the territorial rules of the Oregon Territory that prevented persons of color from owning land at that time. George Bush's sons would continue to live on that land. His grandson would eventually take over that land. His son, William Owen Bush, he was unique in that he became the first Black legislature to the Washington Territory's legislative body. And during his time there, William Owen Bush would continue his father's agricultural legacy in the form of creating the documents and the bill that would eventually be passed that created Washington's first agricultural college. Today, we know it as Washington State University. The legacy of the Bush family can be seen. A good portion of the Olympia Airport is home to part of the original acreage of the Bush Prairie Farm that the Bush family established. Tumwater, the legacy of Tumwater, the middle school, and even some trees and plaques that have now been planted and established throughout the Olympia area at the Capitol building, one of the middle schools being named for George W. Bush. There has been some debate. People think because there was a man named George Washington, a black man down the road there in Lacey, Washington, and they felt that his name and George Bush's names got smashed together. However, if we look at this land record, George Washington Bush identifies himself on this Missouri land record before he would later sell it and move his way to Oregon. George Washington Bush is how he acknowledges himself to the land surveyor there in Missouri. So without a doubt, it was George W. Bush, not just the George W. Bush of the modern era, but George W. Bush, who we do not have any images or portraits of. The image you see here that I've superimposed on the seal of the state of Washington's flag is that of a 1969 artist rendering of what perhaps George W. Bush may or may not have looked like. For whatever reason, while we have images of Colonel Simmons and we have images of several of Mr. Bush's sons, and we even have images in the Washington Historical Society's collection of Isabella Bush with her children, we unfortunately have no known images of George W. Bush, which is why we do what we do here at the Toothless Historian. We want to remind folks that in one person's lifetime, they will die twice. First, upon their physical death, like George W. Bush in April of 1863. And then again, he will die a second time when no one's left to remember their name and tell their story. Today, the Toothless Historian remembers George Washington Bush, veteran of the War of 1812, pioneer of the Oregon Trail in 1844, and a pioneer, founder of Thurston County, Washington Territory, Tumwater, Washington, Bush Prairie, Washington.
George Washington Bush was a true American, and yet without a country. He owed allegiance to the flag, and yet the flag would not own him. He was firmly held to obey the law, and yet the law would not protect him, and his oath would not be taken in a court of law. Ezra Meeker. A biographical sketch of Washington pioneer George W. Bush.
Watchman, watchman, what is the hour? Midnight has rung, freedom has come.